Welcome back, deep divers. We love to dig into the unusual here, the hidden corners of thought and experience. And today, we're going deep on something we all have, but rarely talk about, the so-called sixth sense.
Right off the bat, I think it's important to clarify we're not diving into the paranormal or anything like that.
Yeah, no ghost hunting today.
Our guide for this exploration is actually a book from 1911, The Sixth Sense. It's Cultivation and Use by Charles Henry Brent. Now, Brent wasn't talking about spooky stuff either.
More like the human sense, as he called it.
Yeah.
The thing that makes us, us.
Exactly. He saw it as this underlying faculty, something he called the mystic sense, that influences how we understand the world, how we think, even how we feel. And he believed it was absolutely essential for pretty much everything we do, from basic health to our spiritual lives.
Which, might sound a little out there at first. But he makes this fascinating connection to our physical senses, the ones we all know and love.
Think about it. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, they seem so different, but they all develop from that one basic sense, touch. It's like touch specialized to pick up on different kinds of information. And they work together, right? Like if you lose your sight, your hearing often becomes sharper.
It's like they compensate.
Exactly. Brent saw the mystic sense working in a similar way. But instead of physical sensations, it's tuned in to something beyond that.
So less about what we can touch and see and more about what lies beneath, right? The meaning behind things, the essence.
Absolutely. And it's not just passively receiving information. It helps us discern the value of things, their inner character. It allows us to grasp the inside of reality, so to speak.
And this isn't just some small scale, everyday kind of thing, is it?
Not at all. Brent argues it extends to what he calls the divine altitudes. So not just navigating the day-to-day, but connecting us to something bigger than ourselves.
I love how he phrases that divine altitudes. It really captures the scope of what he's getting at.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. It's connected to our other faculties, our intellect and emotions.
So it's not like it's totally separate from the rest of who we are.
Exactly. It draws on those things. But it also operates independently, offering its own unique insights. It's like it suggests things rather than being dictated to by our rational minds.
So it's a sense, but it's also a source of knowledge. Or maybe a way of knowing.
I think that's a great way to put it. And Brent sees this sense playing a huge role in how we grow, how we develop as individuals.
In everything from our physical health. I mean, he even argues that a strong sense of purpose, even ideals, can impact our well-being.
To our creativity, our moral compass, our sense of right and wrong. And get this, he even believes it helps us understand the vastness of the universe and the tiny, intricate world of atoms, all through this inner faculty of perception.
Which, again, might sound like a stretch, but he draws some really intriguing parallels to our physical senses. He talks about clear-eyed perception within this mystic sense, like sight, and sensitivity to subtle messages, like hearing, and a kind of testing of values similar to how we use taste or touch.
He acknowledges that people might say, well, isn't this just the mind? Isn't this just thinking?
Right, like what makes this different?
And Brent tackles that head on. He says, sure, there's overlap. But this sense goes beyond mere rational thought, even beyond willpower. He uses the term conceptual reason as a kind of analogy, highlighting its ability to generate new understanding, to grasp ideas that go beyond what we can logically deduce.
So it's not just about working through things step by step, but having these leaps of understanding, those aha moments.
Exactly. And he gets to the heart of how this sense actually functions. He boils it down to faith.
Okay, hold on. Now we're getting into religious territory.
Right. Not quite. He's using faith in a broader sense. He's talking about that willingness to trust in something, to give substance to our hopes, even when we don't have concrete proof. It's about, as he puts it, testing the unseen.
So it's not just about blind belief. It's about a kind of active engagement with the world.
Exactly. And he applies this concept of faith to all sorts of things, not just religion. Science, for example. Think about a scientist forming a hypothesis. They have to have faith in that idea before they have all the data to prove it.
It's like that initial spark that drives inquiry.
Exactly. And the same goes for morality, striving towards ideals. It's this underlying trust in something beyond the immediately tangible. It's the mystic sense operating in different spheres of life.
So where does this all happen? Where is the workshop of this mystic sense, so to speak?
Brent puts it beautifully. He talks about the uplands of life, a realm of ideas and ideals. It's where we get that sense of the bigger picture, the overarching view. But it's also where we delve into the depths, uncovering hidden meanings and connections.
Okay, I've got to ask about this because it really grabbed my attention. He talks about this idea that objective and subjective realities aren't actually separate, but are two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. He says there's the absolute truth, the way things really are,
Hmm.
and then there's our individual understanding of that truth. And the goal is to continually refine our perception, to bring our subjective experience closer and closer to that ultimate reality.
It's like we're trying to align our inner compass with true north.
I like that analogy. And here's another fascinating idea. He proposes an objective psychic or spiritual world, but not in some far-off dimension.
Right, not some ethereal plane of existence.
Exactly. He says it's right here, woven into the fabric of the physical world.
So every material thing has a spiritual dimension to it.
That's the idea. The physical and the spiritual are interconnected, and the true value of the physical is in its capacity to express that spiritual essence.
So how do we actually perceive this non-physical inside of things?
That's where our uniquely human abilities come into play. Animals have instincts. They can sense danger. They can find food.
But we're talking about something more than that, a deeper level of understanding.
Exactly. And Brent emphasizes that there's no fundamental conflict between the physical and the spiritual. He sees the physical world as a kind of conduit, a way for us to experience and understand spiritual realities.
It's like the material world is the language through which the spiritual world speaks.
That's a great way to put it. And he says the problem arises when we focus only on the material aspects of things, neglecting that spiritual dimension.
It reminds me of that quote, "The truly real is a thing that has an inside, and you can't get to that inside with your five senses alone."
You hit the nail on the head. The more we fixate on the external, the harder it becomes to perceive that underlying essence.
It's like judging a book by its cover.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Brent argues that spiritual realities are grasped by spiritual faculties. There has to be a kind of resonance, a natural affinity between the observer and the observed.
So you can't fully understand something unless you have that inner capacity to perceive it.
Right. And this brings up a really important point. Reality isn't just about the physical world that we can perceive with our senses. It's a much broader concept that encompasses all of existence, even the things we can't see or touch. And it influences us, even passively. But we can tap into its full potential by consciously engaging with it, by aligning our subjective experiences with that objective reality.
And he talks about how everything is interconnected, the physical, the spiritual, the mental, and there's this kind of energy, this attraction that drives this interconnectedness.
And for us humans, with our conscious minds, our choices actually play a role in shaping those connections.
So we're not just passive receivers, we're active participants.
Precisely. And while Brent puts a lot of emphasis on this mystic sense, he doesn't dismiss the importance of our physical senses. They're the starting point. They gather the initial information.
It's like they provide the raw data, and the mystic sense helps us interpret it on a deeper level.
I like that analogy. Now, Brent makes a distinction between someone who's, let's say, mystically inclined, meaning they have a well-developed sense of this inner perception, and a technical mystic who might focus intensely on subjective experiences. And he cautions against going too far in either direction.
So it's about balance.
Exactly. You don't want to lose touch with objective reality, but you also don't want to ignore your inner experiences.
He even warns against relying solely on the mystic sense, saying that could lead to chaos.
He quotes Terrell on this, actually.
Yeah.
Terrell talks about how important it is to distinguish between our subjective experiences and objective facts, and how blurring that line can lead to, as he puts it, a kind of madness, a disconnect from shared reality.
So the key is to hold both in mind the subjective and the objective without confusing them.
Absolutely. Now, this brings up a really interesting question. How do we navigate this realm of spiritual perception and avoid mistaking illusions for genuine insights?
Right. How do we tell the difference between, I don't know, wishful thinking and actual spiritual truth?
Brent argues this is a crucial function of the mystic sense, working in conjunction with our other faculties. Some of it is intuitive, but he says we need to cultivate the ability to discern between fleeting fantasies and genuine spiritual realities, to properly understand and categorize those ideals that come to us through the mystic sense.
So it's not just about having these experiences, it's about learning to interpret them correctly.
Exactly. And here's a critical safeguard he emphasizes: corporate testing.
Okay, so not like going to the boardroom to get approval for your spiritual insights.
Not exactly. He's talking about checking our perceptions against the collective wisdom of humanity.
So bouncing your ideas off others, getting feedback.
More than that, it's about comparing our individual experiences to establish knowledge, to shared experiences, to see if they hold up.
Because if you go too far down the rabbit hole of just your own personal experiences, you could end up in a pretty strange place.
That's the idea. He says that excessive individualism in this realm can lead to eccentricity or even delusion. Truly discerning individuals, he argues, check their perceptions against what he calls the age-long, man-wide experiences of humanity. Think of it as validating your personal map against the known world.
So you're not just relying on your own limited perspective, you're grounding your insights in something larger.
Exactly. And this is particularly important in the spiritual realm, he says, because otherwise you could end up with, as he puts it, a mob of eccentrics and fanatics. People whose subjective experiences are completely untethered from any kind of shared reality.
And he gives the example of St. Teresa, right? She had these incredibly intense mystical experiences, but he points out that they needed to be understood within the existing framework of Christian spiritual thought to make sure they weren't just personal delusions.
Right. Her vision of the rosary cross turning into precious stones, which she was the only one who could see, highlights the need to interpret even the most profound personal experiences within a broader context.
So it's like, even with something as powerful and personal as a mystical vision, you still need that external validation.
Absolutely. And finally, Brent emphasizes what he calls the law of use in relation to the mystic sense. Like any skill or faculty, it strengthens with practice and weakens with neglect. Focusing too much on one aspect while ignoring others leads to unbalanced development.
So it's like a muscle, you have to exercise it to keep it strong.
Precisely. And that's really the overarching aim of his book. He wants to show how this mystic sense works in everyday life, encourage us to have more confidence in it, to use it more fully, and ultimately to cultivate this innate gift that we all possess.
So this isn't just some abstract philosophical concept. He's saying this has real practical implications for how we live our lives.
Exactly. And he even addresses that idea from von Hugel, who argued that there's no distinct mystical faculty. Now, von Hugel did acknowledge that everyone has this recollective, intuitive, deeply emotive element, but Brent says that's exactly what the mystic sense is.
So just because it's widespread doesn't mean it's not a distinct thing.
Right. It's like saying that because the principles of physics apply everywhere, light isn't a distinct phenomenon.
Okay, so let's step back for a moment. What really stands out to me is that Brent isn't talking about something that's only for a select few, some mystical elite.
He's saying this is a fundamental part of being human. It's how we tap into a deeper level of reality beyond what we can physically perceive.
And it has implications for everything from our health to our creative pursuits to our moral compass.
Absolutely. He even talks about how our ideals can impact our well-being. Think about the power of a placebo effect, for example. That's belief influencing physical health.
It really makes you reconsider those moments of intuition, those gut feelings that you can't always explain logically.
Brent would say that's likely your mystic sense picking up on something beyond the surface level.
So what do we do with this information? How do we take this idea of a sixth sense and actually apply it in our lives?
That's a great question. I think the first step is awareness. Start paying attention to those intuitive nudges, those flashes of insight that seem to come from beyond your rational mind.
And maybe try to cultivate that sense of trust in your own inner knowing.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to explore different perspectives, to challenge your own assumptions. That can help you refine your perception and get closer to that objective truth that Brent talks about.
It's like expanding your inner map of reality.
Exactly. And if you're really intrigued by this, I'd encourage you to check out Brent's book. It's a fascinating exploration of this often overlooked aspect of human experience.
Who knows? Maybe it'll even unlock some hidden potential in your own life.
So, to leave you with a final thought, what if consciously cultivating this sixth sense is the key to living a more meaningful, more fulfilling, and ultimately more human life?
That's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.